Well, welcome to CS50's office hours. I'm here at the moment on my mobile device because we thought we'd try something a little different today. As you may know, we've been recording this really from all over the internet with all of us in our respective homes in recent weeks, but we thought we'd try something a little bit new. For the past few months, really no one has been working here on campus at Harvard. Everyone's been working or staying home safely with their family and friends. I'm collaborating with colleagues online. But in anticipation of the fall semester, when we hope to bring CS50 back online, the plan now is to experiment today a little bit in a space that might look familiar. Let me go ahead and flip my camera around and welcome then to Sanders Theater. There's no students here today and there's barely any of CS50's staff, but we thought we'd offer you a view of what it looks like when a student does typically enter in ordinary years into a space like this. Down here we have what's called the orchestra section where students can see on the stage most closely. Alternatively, upon entering, students can walk upstairs like these into the so-called mezzanine. And the mezzanine wraps all the way around the theater. And indeed, this space, Sanders Theater, holds some 1,000 attendees, whether it's for a class or a performance or any other gathering here. In fact, there's even more space up above such that folks can sit and stand on the balcony as needed. But today, we're going to go ahead and use CS50's equipment in a somewhat different way. We've gone ahead and set up some of our gear from the fall semester in such a way that it's actually facing the back of the stage and not the front in the usual way. And we've set up, for instance, this large display here, as well as CS50's own Andrew Markham, if you'd like to wave hello. Andrew is helping us manage things behind the scenes here. All of these wires are what are going to make possible today's office hours. And connected to that screen, as you'll soon see, is you all. So we have gallery mode in Zoom up here on the screen so that we can see everyone there. And indeed, I see some folks waving. And so you're waving at me, who's then broadcasting back to you. And I have my own screen here on a Mac so that I can also see you on my screen. And oh, who is this?
Hi, everyone.
This seems to be CS50's own Brian Yu. And what better way to begin today's office hours than CS50's own Brian?
All right. Thanks very much, David. Welcome, everyone, to Office Hours. It's so great to have you all here. For those who haven't used Zoom before, just a couple of things that might be helpful for you to know. Down at the bottom, you should see a button that says Participants, which will then let you open up the chat window where you'll be able to interact with other classmates. If you'd like to ask a question at today's Office Hours, just an opportunity for you to ask questions, you should fill out this form at this URL that you're seeing on the screen right now. Don't use the raise hands feature in Zoom itself. Afraid there are just too many people, and to make sure that we're able to try and get to as many questions as we can, if you do have a question, just be sure to fill out the form at this URL right here. And today, we happen to be introduced by a special guest as well. And David, would you like to introduce our special guest?
Absolutely. So you may know him from any number of CS50 shorts, the short videos that accompany lectures and other aspects of the class. Those shorts are opportunities to dive in all the deeper to some topic, as well as from a different perspective, from someone like Doug, who has a very different perspective on some of the topics than I might in lecture. And so without further ado, allow us to invite him to introduce himself, CS50's own Doug Lloyd.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Many of you probably know me from the Shorts videos, but I'm looking forward to tackling some of your questions today. So thanks for joining us.
Well, so good to see you. Doug is not here in Sanders Theater. Indeed, even Brian and I are at least 12 feet apart, as is Andrew today. But Doug is joining us from the internet far away so that we can all be here together. And we thought Doug would begin, much like we did last time a few weeks back when CS50's own Zamila Chan joined us, with a question of you, which is to say, how did you find your way to CS50? What is your origin story?
So my origin story with CS50 goes back probably a little further than most folks. I actually took CS50 in 2006, which is before David actually took over the course. It was with his predecessor, Mike Smith. In 2007, as usually happens when a new faculty member takes over a course, there's usually a spike in interest. And it so happened that David ran out of TFs for the course, and I was a last-minute addition to join the course in fall of 2007. And he couldn't get rid of me. I just stuck around for 12 years. I was a TF until 2014. In 2015, I joined the staff full-time, initially working on CS50 AP, which some of you may be familiar with as well, and then eventually taking over running the course for the last 4 years until I handed that off to Brian. At the end of 2019, I moved away from Massachusetts. I now live in Colorado, but I'm still involved with edX-related work and work through our extension school. So I've been a little bit of everything. I've been a teaching fellow, a course assistant, course manager. It's been a 14-year journey with CS50 so far.
And allow me to disclaim, Doug is too humble. Doug has been among our most extraordinary staff members involved in so many different roles. And we're so glad, Doug, that you could rejoin us here today. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can today. But as always, please forgive if we run short of time. We'll be sure to do these again. Brian?
Hi, Doug. Good to see you again. Speaking of edX, I just wanted to ask a little bit about CS50L, CS50 for Lawyers, which I know that you teach. Could you tell us a little bit about what it's about, what the inspiration for it was, and what it is that students can get out of that class?
Sure. So among those 14 years after I graduated college, I actually went to law school and became an attorney. And I was a practicing attorney for several years, but I didn't like it, so I went back to CS50 full time. But what I wanted to do was we had, David a couple of years ago offered CS50 for business professionals, and we have CS50's Introduction to Technology. And, David and I got to talking a couple of years ago about how it would be really beneficial for attorneys to know a little bit about technology as well, especially where many software companies need to hire attorneys or where legal work is becoming increasingly digital. It's kind of a profession that relies a lot on paper and books, but it's becoming increasingly digital. And so David and I worked together to put together a course that would be beneficial for attorneys or law students or anybody who thinks about going into law. And so we take a look at CS50 from a different level, a higher level, as opposed to being very bottom up as CS50 itself is, or CS50X itself is. CS50L is much more top down. So looking at the broad topic of cloud computing, looking at the broad topic of building a database or challenges at the intersection of law and technology. And so our goal is really just to give people a lawyer's perspective on computer science or a computer science perspective for lawyers. And we've had lots of students take the course, and hopefully you've all enjoyed it. But yeah, it was a great pleasure to work with David and co-teach that course, which I think we've prepared in 2019, but it remains on edX for a little while longer. The material is certainly still fresh today.
Well, thank you, Doug, again. So why don't we turn things over now to you all. If you would like to ask questions, again, go to that URL that Brian put up. And I do think, I think we can call on our first question here. How about we call on Scott, if you'd like, or Nick. Brett, let's go with Nick. Sorry, Nick. Nick, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from.
Yeah, hi, my name's Nick. I'm from Minnesota in the United States. And my question is, what are some hard truths that you think a beginner computer science student is better off knowing before encountering maybe the harder way? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can answer this briefly and then turn it over to perhaps Doug or Brian as well. I think it never really stops taking a lot of time to solve problems when it comes to software. So even though I've been programming now for some 20 years in various languages, I'm still struck by the fact that most any project I take on involving programming takes at least twice as much time, if not way more than I originally anticipate. I think part of this is because there's always unforeseen challenges and bugs that you encounter that end up really taking way more time than you might have enjoyed. But there's also, I think, this opportunity quite often where you can go down these rabbit holes and add another feature or clean up this code or do better. And so it's very much this iterative process. And I don't think I ever realized early on that programs are not necessarily ever really finished. They might be usable. But even to this day, when I feel like I'm done with some coding project, literally the next morning, I'm waking up thinking, oh, I should have done this differently, or oh, I should add this feature as well. Doug or Brian, do you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing to really take away is that when you're learning at the beginning, it actually really can be discouraging, and it's really not a great idea to compare yourself to other people in terms of how long it takes you to learn something. When I took CS50 myself, I got a B. Like I didn't walk away from it feeling like I know everything about computer science right now, but I still continued on to other courses and got better. Some of my students, though, will, after taking on a teaching role, some students will get it in 2 weeks, or it'll just click. There'll be a moment where suddenly it just happens. And then some people like me, it takes a semester or more than a semester. And I think that as long as you're not comparing yourself to other people and you're just measuring your own progress, that's the most important thing. But if you compare yourself to other people, I think it can be discouraging. Like learning computer science is a little bit like learning how to think. And by the way, that course is taught in Greek, right? So unless you speak Greek as a first language, you're learning two things. You're learning a new way of thinking and a way to express that. So be prepared for that to be a bit challenging, but don't worry about how you do relative to other people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Nick, for your question. But let's go to Sujit next. If Sujit, you'd like to say hello and where you're from.
Hi, David. It's an honor, first of all.
Well, thank you. Likewise. Where are you from, Sujit?
I am from India. It's a town called Dharwad. It's in Karnataka.
Okay.
I've been taking CS50 on edX.
Nice to meet you. What is your question today for the group?
My question is that I'm an architecture student, David, and I feel architecture at this point is at the intersection between science, where we're introducing lots of new technology into architecture, and how I can utilize this knowledge of coding and learning about computers and help better the architecture that's going to, like how the buildings are going to perform, how people are going to interact with the buildings and such stuff. And where can I get this information?
Where can you get information to learn a bit more about how you can apply computer science to the world of architecture with buildings?
Yes.
Sure. So this is actually a topic that's come up from time to time in CS50 itself, because we actually have a design school, an architectural school at Harvard, for which we have a number of students each year. Brian, do you want to offer some thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of ways. So one of the great things I'll start by saying is that computer science is incredibly applicable to so many other domains, whether it's architecture or other fields as well. With regards to architecture specifically, I'm not an architect myself, but I know that a big area of new research within computer science is all about 3D and virtual reality and augmented reality, so AR and VR, if you're familiar with those terms. And so there's a lot of interesting work being done right now with computer science as it relates to architectural rendering and architectural visualization. So if that's something that interests you, I think there's a lot of, if you explore a little bit about virtual reality and similar topics, there's probably applications there. And then more generally, computer science can be quite useful for doing simulations, where it would take a lot of cost and a lot of materials and resources and time to build an actual building in order to test something out. Computer simulations can often answer questions for us much more quickly and much more efficiently. And so the ability to write code to simulate a physical world without having to build it yourself, I think has a lot of practical applications too.
In fact, it's funny you should ask today, too, because a few of us have been chatting recently about how Harvard might try to scan digitally in 3 dimensions a lot of the buildings on campus, especially right now while they're really not being used and there aren't any students living on campus. So in fact, Brian, do you mind pulling up perhaps that one demonstration of Widener Library? So as you might know, CS50 at Harvard all holds what are called real office hours in this beautiful library on campus. And so what some of our colleagues did recently were they brought in some fancy cameras, took 3-dimensional images of the inside of this library. And if you've ever gone on a website for real estate, if someone's looking into renting an apartment or buying a home, it's very common to show visualizations of spaces now. And Zoom probably isn't going to show this as well as it will on your own computer. So we'll paste into the chat window this same URL. But what Brian has just pulled up is an example of Widener Library. This is the space that we happen to hold physical office hours in during ordinary semesters. And on your own Mac or PC or even phone, if your internet connection is fast enough, odds are you'll be able to click and drag and explore this 3-dimensional space. And that's an amazing application of CS and software in particular, I think, to the design of indoor and outdoor spaces. So thank you, Sujit, for that question. Can we go next to Jarvis, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from? Jarvis?
Oh, I'm Jarvis. I'm calling from Kenya. I would like to thank you for the CS50. So my question is, I'm in the field of computer technology where I'm learning more of computer hardware. So what would you recommend for me, like which languages for system development or programming? Thank you.
OK, so you're studying computer hardware, and you would like to know what languages in particular would benefit you to learn in that space. Doug, do you want to think back on your CS days and offer your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, C is actually a pretty good one, honestly, from CS50. It's one of the most low-level languages that you can learn. It lets you do things to memory pretty at a low level compared to other languages. When I was taking a computer hardware course myself, I used a language called Verilog. It's been a very long time since I used it, so I can't tell you too much more about it, but that was also pretty useful. I think that, honestly, I mean, I don't know how far along you are in your hardware programming, but getting your hands on like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis are also just fun to tinker with. They also generally use C or some language based on C to program them. So you might have some familiarity with it from CS50X, but that's what I used. I used Verilog and C when I took a architecture course, computer architecture course.
If helpful, I've just pasted into the chat window a link to Wikipedia to something called assembly language, which if you're about halfway through CS50, you might recall we introduced relatively briefly. As Doug described, C is about as close as you can go to the hardware when it comes to programming. And indeed, if you go one level further, things start to look even scarier pretty quickly. And that's in the form of some form of assembly language. It might be something called x86 or MIPS, or there's many, many different architectures out there. And this is a lower level form of programming. But back in the day, this is how people program systems. And long story short was after humans started programming in zeros and ones, and then in assembly language, and then in C, do we actually have even more modern languages like Python and the like. But these are very applicable still, especially for embedded systems and small devices. So thank you for that question as well. How about next, can we go to Joshua, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from.
I'm from London. I started recently doing CS50X. I was just wondering, what age did you start programming, and what languages did you start with?
A really good question. We could probably each answer this. Brian, do you want to think back first?
Yeah, sure. So in high school, my junior year of high school, I took AP Computer Science A, which at the time was the College Board's only computer science class, which was a class that was taught in Java. So I learned a little bit of Java. I honestly couldn't remember a whole lot of that right now. But that was where things started for me. And after that, the next class I took was actually CS50. So I started learning C. And at the time, CS50 taught PHP as the language after C. Now, of course, they use Python instead. But those were my first couple of languages.
Doug, how about you? Stroll down memory lane.
In earnest, I was 19. It was CS50 was my first real programming course. I took a couple of programming courses in middle school, like sort of elective things, but it really wasn't learning fundamentals, so I was almost 20.
Yeah, and in my case, the first formal class I ever took was indeed CS50. That was sophomore year of college, so that was when I was probably 19 years old, give or take. Prior to that, I remember in high school or middle school, I think I signed up for some week-long summer camp where we learned how to program in Logo, which is like this turtle-based language where you can move something up, down, left, or right, and I think I made tic-tac-toe. It was the geekiest summer camp you'd ever seen, I'm sure. But we didn't really learn computer science or learn that much about programming, but because in fact I didn't try it again, I guess, for another 5 or 10 years. And then I do remember growing up, I think I was given by someone a programming book, and this was a book about BASIC, which is an even older programming language. And the thing about BASIC is that as you write your code, the convention was to actually number your own lines. So these days, if you use a text editor, the lines get numbered for you, and those numbers don't end up in your code. Rather, they're just there as a visual cue to you as to where things are. But with a language like BASIC, you actually number your own lines. And in anticipation of probably changing your code, fixing a bug, adding a feature, the convention is to number your lines initially every 10 numbers. So this is line 10, line 20, line 30, line 40, and so forth, thereby leaving you plenty of room for 9 mistakes to fix. And I don't think I ever got something working. The book in question, too, had a really hard to read font, or at least that's my excuse back in the day. And I don't think I got any of my code to actually run. But I remember it was like this Star Wars book. And I think I even found it recently on eBay. But it's been years since I actually flipped through it. So short answer, CS50, 19 years old for me. All right, well, thank you for your question, Joshua. Can we go next to Justin, if you'd like to say hello and where you are from? Still muted. If you have multiple microphones, you might need to click the little triangle next to the mute or unmute button and choose a different microphone, perhaps. Well, let's try to circle back in just a moment, if that's OK. If you want to tinker on your end, we'll try to come back in a few minutes. And if we forget next time, certainly. Agraj, could we go next to you? Agraj, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from, and how do you pronounce your name?
I'm Agraj from India.
Nice to meet you.
What kept you motivated while learning to code at your time?
What kept me motivated when learning to code? Let's see, Doug, can we go back to you?
Small victories. It's really important to take problems and break them down. I think that we've tried to make this the case in our specifications as well, but it can be really overwhelming to like see a problem for the first time and be like, what do I do? And learning how to compartmentalizing it and having these small victories that slowly build up towards what you're getting for is very motivating, sort of gamifying what you're trying to do.
Well, thank you for that question as well. Can we try going back to Justin? I'm going to cross my fingers this time. Justin, if your mic might be working.
How about now?
Yes, success. Okay, the floor is yours.
I'm Justin taking CS50 EDX. I'm based in New York. And I am older, I'm like in my 30s, and I am very excited about CS50, and I've had a lot of fun so far, and I feel very intimidated though by what feels like the inevitability of using sort of math that I was always afraid of earlier in life. I sort of met on things like calculus, and I really struggled with statistics, I remember, sort of like in late high school and college. And I'm curious if you have like sort of guidance on how somebody who is like more of a liberal arts type person should sort of confront that kind of trepidation about math in CS50 and beyond, really.
Yeah, Doug, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to field this?
Well, I was mostly taking issue to being called old in my 30s as well, but that's okay. I'm going to pass it off to Brian in a second because I think he also would have a good take on this. But I think know that CS50 only expects algebra. Like calculus and statistics and stuff are not really going to come into play for you. But everybody's going to tackle this differently. It's really hard to answer for me to answer this question in the abstract because I think that everybody's approach is going to be a little bit different. But I have had plenty of students, half of our students right now are taking this course as an elective, right? Typically in the last couple of years, they come in from history, from English, from government, and they thrive. So I think it's really just motivating yourself and realizing where your strengths and weaknesses are and try and play to your strengths and just focus on the weaknesses and try and chip away at it. But let me pass it off to Brian because Brian studied in some he has a joint major in both computer science and a liberal art.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Doug said. I'd just add that a lot of what you can do in computer science is more about thinking methodically than it is about mathematics, and especially higher level mathematics with things like calculus and linear algebra. Like I took calculus and linear algebra classes, but I basically never use any of that material in my day-to-day work in computer science. And I'd also add that even in the areas where higher level math tends to be more important, so areas like artificial intelligence and machine learning, where a lot of that is a lot of linear algebra, in many cases someone else has already written a lot of the code to do most of the mathematics part of it. So there are libraries out there where someone has already written code to implement a neural network using linear algebra, for example, so that you can just use that code and run machine learning programs yourself without needing to know any of that underlying math. So that's one of the nice things about computer science as well. You can build on top of the work of other people without needing to implement all of the details yourself.
And for what it's worth, I think this is such a common thing for folks to be a little uncomfortable with or turned off by math. And I think this is in part how it's generally taught, at least in the US. I mean, at least in my experience, you take a lot of math classes as a kid where it's a lot of mechanics and it's a lot of problem after problem after problem, but without really a view of why you're learning how to take that derivative, why you're trying to integrate numbers, why you're trying to solve a system of equations. And honestly, it wasn't until I took in high school a class in physics where all of a sudden certain aspects of math began to make more sense and why first or second derivatives are actually compelling. And if you're rusty on that or have never heard them, that's fine. But it was in the context of another field that I finally found math to be interesting. And so I would take comfort in that too. CS50, as Doug says, doesn't particularly require more than arithmetic or a little bit of algebra so that you're familiar with using symbols like x and y and variables more generally. But invariably, if you go off and study more about graphics or artificial intelligence, honestly, you can pick up the math that you need along the way. So I wouldn't worry about your discomfort now. You can get comfortable over time. Well, thank you for that question. Let's go next to Raheem, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from.
Hi, David. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. I'm just wondering, why is there so much emphasis based on C in the CS50 for the first bit? Is that basically because it's a base level and building up from there?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a frequently asked question, why we use C in CS50. And we have now in the course for the 13 years I've taught the class and for a good 7 or 10 years prior to that as well. I think philosophically, even though C is absolutely more challenging for some students, including myself back in the day, in large part because of memory management and pointers and the like, I think it really does give you a bottom-up understanding of what's going on underneath the hood of the computer, so to speak. Nothing is going to happen in your program unless you write the code to do that. No data is going to move from one location to another in a program unless you write the code to do that. And so in that sense, there really isn't much magic at that level. And when we then transition mid-semester to a higher level, more modern language like Python, and we introduce, for instance, dictionaries or associative arrays or hashes, however you want to think about them, there's this potential for this amazing aha moment for students in that 1 week prior in CS50, they might have spent 10, 20 or more hours implementing their own hash table in C for the spell checking problem set. And yet the next week, oh my God, you can distill all of this C code into essentially one line or very few lines of code. But there too, it's not magic because you know at that point what the computer must be doing underneath the hood in order to make that feature possible to you. And in a class like CS50, many of our students, about half, only take CS50 and they don't go on to take other courses in computer science. They then go back to their own fields in the arts or humanities or social sciences or sciences more generally. And so many students won't necessarily look any further down under than the language or the languages that they're taught in that first course. And I think we would do a disservice to students if we only taught the class at this conceptual level, at this abstraction level, if you will, and didn't really show them what's going on much closer to the hardware. I'd like to think it turns students into aspiring computer scientists, into software engineers, as opposed to just a programmer who might have only learned something at this level. It's a more sophisticated, deep understanding, and all the more empowering, we hope, at term's end. Well, thank you for that question. Allow us
one
to...
thing, actually. The other thing I want to just mention, too, is that C is probably among the oldest languages that's still used, and so many languages since have based their syntax on what C originally did. And so by knowing C, you really can grok a new language very quickly, like C++, Java, Python, like all these languages that you use today trace their structure back to C.
Indeed, and allow me to chime in with one other link here in the chat window. If you see this here, I spent probably a good hour thinking about this question a few years ago and answering the same question on Quora, so you might find a more eloquent answer from me online as well. That's in the chat window now. How about, can we go next to Marinos, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Hello, I am from Athens, Greece. I really enjoyed your courses. I've seen CS50 at edX, and it was my first computer science course. I'm 15. And I would like to ask you how to find the programming language that suits me the best. How to know which programming language is the best for me to use to write my code.
Really good question. Brian, you know quite a few languages. How would you answer that?
Yeah, sure. Great question. There are two things that I'd say. The first thing that I would say is that you should first start by thinking about what kinds of problems you want to solve or what it is that you want to do, because oftentimes the type of problem you're trying to solve will lend itself towards one language or another. If you're looking to build a web application, usually a language like Python or Ruby or JavaScript is probably a good fit for that. If you're looking to build a mobile app, there are different languages that tend to be good for that too. But the second thing I'd add is just that it's a good idea to try them. Early on, when you're just starting to learn to program, try learning more languages, even if you don't feel totally confident in all the languages you already know. As Doug sort of alluded to, the first language is kind of the hardest. And once you know one language like C, it becomes easier then to pick up other languages because a lot of the ideas are very similar to each other. And so by exploring a little bit, you might find a language that suits your own personal preferences in terms of the design decisions within that language that also lends itself towards trying to solve the problems that you want to solve. For me personally, I happen to quite like both Python and TypeScript as my two sort of languages of choice, but for everyone, that answer is going to be different.
But next up, I think, is Rosa. If you'd like to say hello and where you are from.
Yes, my name is Rosa. I'm from Houston, Texas, originally from the Dominican Republic. I run a small program teaching kids math, coding, and robotics. So I was wondering, many of my students don't have an algebra background quite yet. So how do I get them? And we teach them primarily by using some intro Python and then as well some Python Turtle. How do I get them introducing to the course that you all are talking about in computer science in a way that is engaging and leaves them wanting to learn more in high school?
Sure. No, that's great that you start them off already with Python. Doug, how did you think about that, especially with our AP initiatives?
Yeah, so the big thing that I wanted to do when I was putting CS50 AP together was to take CS50 itself and stretch it out. Like, we have 13 weeks to teach it, and in a typical school setting in the United States anyway, it's about 36 weeks total for a school year. And so it was really just about taking time and really dragging it out. We also had several teachers who taught this in 6th and 7th and 8th grade, and what they did was they took the course itself and split it into 2 years or 3 years and just really spend a lot of time drilling and focusing students on things. I mean, at some point, algebra is going to be a bit inescapable early because you need to understand how a variable works in order to execute a loop or generally do a condition. But I think it's really just time. And I think that but an approach for students who maybe are struggling with text-based languages is to really rely on drag-and-drop programming languages like Scratch and Snap and Google App Inventor, because then you're taking away part of the challenge of learning or getting your head around it, which is the syntax, and really just having it be blocks where all these puzzle pieces fit together. That way you can teach the concepts, and then you can sort of pull that away and be like, here's how we would do it now, and look at all these additional features that we get out of it. But I think time and trying to abstract away some of the stuff that's maybe a bit more arcane will probably help middle school students get the hang of it a little quicker.
Absolutely. And Rosa, please feel free to reach out to us at ap@cs50.harvard.edu if you'd like to continue the chat, or if we can be helpful by sending over any links. Well, thank you for your question. Can we go next to Javier, if you'd like to say hello and where you are from? Javier?
Yeah, I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm a dentist and I work in dental auditory, actually. This is my first experience in programming and I'm very motivated about that. I would like you to tell me which steps studying will I have to take after CS50 Introduction to Computers in order to link my career with programming and in the future design more efficient tools for me and my colleagues, of course.
Gotcha. Can I go to our local language expert, Brian? Do you want to chime in on that and how you might continue your studies of CS, especially in the field of dental medicine or perhaps medicine more generally?
Yeah, certainly. So the first thing I'd say is that if you're looking for ways to apply computer science to your workplace, a good place to start is by looking for places where you can make something more efficient. Look for a task that happens at your workplace that happens again and again and again, or something that just feels tedious, like a lot of manual work. And oftentimes there will be ways that you could write a program in a language like Python, for example, that will automate some of the stuff that ends up being tedious to free up more of your time and your colleagues' time to work on other tasks instead. The other thing I'd add is that in terms of medicine in particular, a big area where medicine and computer science are interacting these days is in the world of artificial intelligence, that increasingly computers are able to help people in the medical profession in terms of how it is that they're looking at reports and how it is that they're interacting with patients. And so learning a little bit of what's going on in that world might end up having some applications to your work as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Javier, for that question. Can we go next to Fazil, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from?
My question is, today we have the technology of all our senses. I mean, we have touchscreen phones, face recognition, speech recognition, hearing aids, and computer vision. But why not smell? I mean, this can, there might be many applications of smell.
Smell. So to recap, we have all of these technologies that capture or generate or detect the various senses, but not smell. I don't have good answers here. I'm hoping Doug is more knowledgeable in this space than I do.
Oh yeah, let's put me on the spot for this one. So you may have seen there was an April Fool's joke recently from Google about Google Nose. That technology does not yet exist. I mean, I don't know why it's not being developed. It's certainly not something that I'm going to develop personally. But I mean, smells are really just chemicals, right? So you need some sort of receptor to understand what the chemicals are and do something to them. I think that finding particular applications for it might be tricky, or figuring out how to get the physical data transformed into something a computer can understand might be tricky. But I guess my answer is I don't know why it's not there. Maybe it just hasn't found a marketable use for it yet, and so it's an expensive technology to develop with no real plan for what to do with it. But I don't see any reason why it couldn't be done, because smells are just chemicals that we can process as humans, and so if we can process them as humans, we can probably teach a computer how to process them as well. I don't know why it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and when it comes to generating smells, I'm here that's a weird way to say it, but I'm no expert on generating smells either. But I do think I've read of examples at like the amusement parks of the world, or even certain movie theaters that have, to my understanding, begun to experiment with the use of smells to add some additional dimension to movies, to add a level of realism. But even I would have to turn to Google for examples. If you are curious, I did paste into the chat window Google's announcement of Google Knows. As Doug mentioned, it was just for fun. But if you'd like to take a look, they did a whole mini marketing campaign around that as well. But a really good question. I'll be curious to see how that one develops. Can we go next to Hassan, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from?
I'm from Morocco.
Nice to meet.
My question is how to stay motivated and not get frustrated about the changes that appear in every time in each language, programming language, and the platform. Especially, we always find that some languages that go up and down in popularity. So how we can stick with one language and stay motivated?
Yeah, no, that's a really good one and a frustrating one. The world of tech and languages does seem to move at a pretty quick rate, especially the JavaScript world lately, for instance. Brian, do you want to answer how you think about this and changing trends?
Yeah, so I think that it's definitely important to be mindful that some languages are going to progress more quickly and have more changes than other languages, in part just because of when technologies are newer, they tend to change a little bit more often. So especially in recent years, this has been the case for things like mobile applications, where mobile languages and frameworks have been changing so quickly over time just because it was relatively new. And now there's still things that are still changing, but the pace of change has maybe slowed down a little bit. So there are definitely more well-established languages that are unlikely to change in the near future. So languages like C have been around for quite a while, and so the syntax of C probably isn't going to be changing. There are definitely places there where you can look to as well. The other thing I just try to be mindful of is to, as much as possible, try not to worry too much about memorizing all of the names of the functions and all of the exact syntax, because whenever there's something that you can just look something up in the documentation, look on Python's documentation, for example, to find out what one particular function does. Oftentimes that's good enough instead of having to memorize it all, so that you can spend more of your time focusing on the ideas and the principles and what it is that you want the application to do, which is usually more interesting than worrying about the low-level syntactic details of the program that you're writing.
Agreed. And I can definitely empathize with the frustration. I mean, in JavaScript, I call on as one example because that ecosystem in particular is just changing so quickly. The frameworks that are in vogue, the libraries that are popular, it's really hard to stay on top of it. And I can only imagine the frustration if you've spent months or even a year or more building some really amazing tool or product of your own, perhaps with some colleagues, and then all of a sudden your technology is outdated. And there too, it doesn't mean you should chase these trends and change the languages or technologies that you're using. But it's a fast-moving world, the upside of which is that the tools and languages are hopefully, on the whole, getting better and better. So I would concur with Brian, though, at finding your footing with just a few that do solve problems for you. Well, can we go next a little closer to campus? AJ, if you'd like to say hello and where in the world you are.
Hi, I'm AJ. I'm currently in Ohio. I'm a Harvard student, and I'm taking CS50 over the summer because A, I was too scared to take it in the fall, and B, I'm a history major, so I'd never had any exposure whatsoever to coding. And my roommates are CS majors, so they're like, hey, just take it. So I guess my question is, these are useful skills to know, and so how can these skills be useful in history and the humanities fields? How can I use these as a humanities major?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think we're all flattered that you needed a few hundred miles of buffer to take CS50, but we're glad you'll be with us starting next week, virtually on campus. Doug, so you and Brian have taught the CS100 Arts and Humanities class in computer science. Do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question in general terms, it's sort of limitless, like whatever you want to do with it. I think a quick thing you can think of is, digitizing documents and, analyzing those documents for patterns of speech. Like Brian might know something about that, or maybe. Building databases of information, analyzing different types of art and seeing if there's a trend in like the tone of a piece of artwork versus the colors that are used in it, which is a project that some of my CS100 students used. Building timelines of communications, like letters back and forth between two different people, and seeing if you could track like the tone of it using sentiment analysis, for example. But it's really like, take a problem that you have. It sort of goes back to a question that was asked earlier, and something that you have to generally do pretty manually. Like, is there a way that you can transform this, particularly for history, there's a lot of books and stuff, like, can you transform that into a digital format and then have a computer solve some of the problems for you? Can you write a program to make it more optimized? But really, it's taking whatever kind of problem that you want to solve in history, thinking, how can I automate this process? And it's not just history, it's any field, art, music. You can do all sorts of things, feed data into a computer and ask it to generate some output for you based on whatever problem you're trying to solve.
Brian, do you perhaps want to summarize some of the projects that we've tackled in the Arts and Humanities class too that intersect the two worlds?
Yeah, so the Arts and Humanities class covered some projects that had to do with like museum pieces and curating museum pieces together and trying to organize them and visualize them in an interesting way in a web application. Doug was also alluding to the analysis of documents. That was what my undergraduate research was about, actually. My undergraduate thesis was a project where I was looking at some old texts from American history where people weren't sure exactly who wrote those documents, and I tried to apply tools from computer science to be able to look at those documents and figure out who the original authors were. So definitely lots of potential applications of computer science to the humanities as well.
Well, thank you, AJ, for that question. Let's go next to Khudaja, if you'd like to say hello and where you are from.
My name is Khatija. I'm originally from Pakistan, but currently living in Dubai. So I am a stay-at-home mom, so I'm really looking forward to build an app someday. So my question is it possible for one person to make a reasonable app on their own? Like, for example, in your last project, you also recommend having a few people as a team. So I have been trying to make a few things, but then I get stuck somewhere and then I start over. So I really want to know, is it even possible, like a reasonable app, not that high level, but still, like, would you encourage, or you want me to build a team first and then start working on it?
Oh, it's a really good question. I apologize for mispronouncing your name at the start there. So absolutely yes. And in fact, many CS50 students here on campus, for instance, tackle their final projects completely on their own. I will admit that I prefer starting projects on my own because I can sort of think through all of the pieces, even if eventually I would really benefit from and like the help of some colleagues when it comes to adding features or chasing down bugs or the like. And I think one of the recommendations we give students in CS50 in particular is when you set out to build some application or some website or anything with code, make sure you quantize it with steps that you want to achieve. So we, for instance, in CS50's final project, describe it as a good goal, a better goal, and a best goal. The idea being that if you set out to implement your best goal, like odds are you're probably setting yourself up for failure, at least in the short term, because it's going to take you way longer than you expect. It's going to get you really frustrated. And so it's really helpful, I think, to really take baby steps, if you will, toward a bigger picture goal, but make sure you've set milestones for yourself that you would be happy with. And so, for instance, if you think back to CS50, if you've taken CS50X online and have done at least problem set 1, with the Mario problem set. In recent years, we've tried to guide students to building Mario's pyramid step by step. Years ago, we used to tell students, here's what the pyramid should look like. write code to do this. But it occurred to us, and to me in particular, that would actually help students to think about building something that's not the goal at hand, but it's similar in spirit, and it gets you one step toward that. Then improve upon that, and then improve upon that. So for instance, if you think about it, and if you're familiar with the Mario pyramid that we describe in CS50, we first encourage students just to print out like a square these days. And a square, of course, is not a pyramid, but you know what? At least your code is going to compile if you can get that working. You can get it to be the right size, just not the right shape. And then once your code is compiling and running and working, then you've sort of met the first milestone, the good milestone. After that, you can maybe change it into a pyramid that's left aligned. It turns out it's a little easier conceptually to print a pyramid that's aligned on the left. And so we have students do that as step 2. And then once you have that working, you've hit that milestone. It's still not correct, but it's one step closer. And then the last step, the best goal in the case of even something like Mario, is to shift it over so that it's right aligned instead of left aligned. And I would encourage that same mindset when it comes to building your own application. Like, don't sit down and start thinking, oh, I want it to do this and this and this and this and this other thing. No, like it's going to do this and only this initially. Then you're going to take a day off and then come back to it for step 2 and step 3 and step 4. And truly, to this day, 20 years into this, that's how I approach things. And it just makes you feel good about the progress that you're making as well. So don't get discouraged. You don't need to find team members if you don't want to, but quantize things for yourself. Well, I think we have time for just another question or two. Let's go over to Avanthanshu, if we could. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing this right. Avanthanshu, if you'd like to say hello and how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, hi David. Hi Brian. Hi Doug. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I'm Avanthanshu. I'm from India.
Wonderful. Thank you for correcting me. And what question do you have for us?
Yes, my questions are basically I'm 15 and I started CS50 recently, right? But I'm doing the CS50 web course, and I've been putting a lot of hours into it. However, I found that it's difficult for me to put it into practice when doing the P-sets. So my question is, where can I get a little bit more practice apart from the P-sets, where I can, go about putting into work all the knowledge that I've got from the courses?
Sure, really good question. And for those unfamiliar, let me paste the URL of the web course that you're referring to into the chat window. But I think we have the local expert here, Brian, if you'd like to field.
Thanks for that. Excellent question. And definitely, it's to be expected that the projects can sometimes be challenging. Oftentimes, it's easier to watch someone else write the code and have an understanding for how it's working. And then it requires a little bit of additional work and some thinking in order to be able to write your own project from scratch, for example. So a couple of pieces of advice I'd give there. One would be, as David mentioned in the last question, to quantize things, break things down into steps, because building an entire book recommendation website is a lot of work, but building just the login page, maybe not so much, and maybe that's something more accessible and a place to start. The other thing that I often suggest is if you're able to understand what you see in the lecture, but you're having trouble writing your own code, is to try to recreate the examples from lecture on your own. Without looking at the code that I wrote in lecture, for example, see if you can recreate some of those examples by writing your own code, because maybe then you'll be able to pick up on some of the syntax and some of the ideas to then be able to apply them to your own project. And the final thing I'd say is just to be a little bit patient with it. Definitely whenever I'm building a web application, it takes time and it can sometimes get frustrating, and it can often be helpful just to take a step back, take a break, come back to it when my head's clear. And so definitely being patient and being willing to give the projects time will help you to be more successful with them in the end.
Well, thank you for that question as well. So I think we have time for like one more question. And for those of you unfamiliar, after the last question, we have this tradition of taking a group photograph whereby we all wave and smile for an admittedly awkward number of seconds so that we can screenshot all of the Zoom screens of participants. But before we do that, allow me to call on Kamal, if you'd like to say hello and where you are from.
Hello, my name is Kamal. I'm from India. My question is that I'm 15 years old. Should I start taking CS50 at this time?
Should you start taking CS50 at this time? Well, let's go to our special guest, Doug, if you'd like to answer our final question.
Sure. So CS50 is kind of like grown into an ecosystem. We actually have 8 courses, CS50X being sort of in the middle in terms of complexity. So if you really have no background at all and you're looking for some place to get started, there are two courses I would recommend to start with. We have CS50's Introduction to Technology, CS50T, and CS50 for business professionals, CS50B. Even if you don't intend to go into business yourself, it covers some topics from a different perspective that might set you up nicely if you then proceed into CS50X. CS50L is a little bit more advanced. It's also kind of a precursor, but it's going to assume a bit more knowledge, particularly about the law. It asks a lot more questions that are not CS specific. So it's a bit trickier. I'd say if you have not started before, start with one of those three courses. Then take CS50X, which is going to give you the foundation for programming that you need to take any of the other courses in our ecosystem, which would be CS50 Web, CS50 AI, and CS50 Games. CS50 Mobile is going to be ending in a few weeks. As Brian mentioned earlier, mobile app development moves so quickly that the material has gotten increasingly out of date, so it's going to be retired for now. But basically what our edX courses give you is an opportunity to sort of progress from very little knowledge or foundational knowledge all the way up to building advanced web applications, building basic AIs to solve games, solve problems, and building other games as well. So it's really, you have this whole menu of options to take, and I'd say take a look at CS50T if you're not really sure where to start. See if that's the right pace for you and slowly build up. But remember, this is, learning is a marathon. It's not a race. It's not about how quickly you do something. It's about having a mindset that you're always learning. Earlier somebody asked a question of how do I not feel frustrated when languages change? And I think that part of the answer there is understand that languages are going to change, and the computer science is never something that you master. It's always something that you're learning and you're continually trying to improve and understand and dig deeper on. And I think that the same can apply to our courses and other courses as well. I've been programming for 15 years. I don't consider myself a master in any way, shape, or form. I'm always learning something new, usually from Brian, who's teaching me something new. But having that mindset of, it doesn't matter how quickly I'm going to do it, I'm going to learn it, I'm going to improve myself, I'm going to stick with it, and adopting that mentality, I think will bring you, reap many rewards for you.
And thank you to our special guest, Doug. And allow me to turn things over finally to Brian to bid us adieu.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Really enjoyed hearing all of your questions today. Hope to do this soon, so we'll be in touch about the next one of these. But thank you all so much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care. Goodbye, and thank you to Doug.